Kim's Game by M. D. Lake. "Nora, are you sure you wouldn't like to play Kim's Game with us?" Ms. Bowers called to her from over by the great stone fireplace.
"I'm sure, thank you,"
Nora replied politely, glancing up and then dropping her nose back in her book. Outside, she could hear the rain falling on the sloping roof of the lodge. It had rained steadily ever since they arrived at camp. She was at the far end of the room, curled up on a sofa, her feet tucked under her, as far away from the other girls as she could get. It wasn't that she didn't like them exactly. It was just that, after being cooped up with them for 3 days, they didn't interest her very much. None of them liked to read, and they all seemed to have seen the same television shows and movies. As a result, she couldn't understand half of what they were talking about, or, if she could, why they got so excited about it. "Nora's not very good at Kim's Game," she heard one of the girls say, in a high, clear voice that was meant to carry. "She beat us all yesterday," another one pointed out. "Twice, the first 2 times. Beginner's luck. She lost the 3rd game and then she quit." Nora smiled to herself. She'd never played Kim's Game, never even heard of it until she got to summer camp and the counselors were forced to come up with indoor activities because of the cold weather and rain. But after she'd won the first 2 games, she discovered it was far too easy for her, and so she decided to have fun with the 3rd game. She put down on her list things that weren't there, silly things, but the other girls didn't notice that, and left out obnoxious things that were the tea kettle, the butcher knife, and so, of course, she lost. Even then, she didn't lose by much, because the other girls weren't very observant. They didn't have to be, Nora supposed, in their lives. That thought went through her like a sharp knife, and she realized she was suddenly close to tears. She straightened her back and put her feet firmly down on the floor and told herself she was glad she was so observant. It was a lot more important to notice things with your eyes than to cry with them. She hadn't wanted to come to summer camp. She wanted to stay home, where she could keep an eye on her parents. She knew that something was wrong between them, worse than usual, a lot worse. And she thought that if she were there, she'd at least be able to figure out the meaning of all the little things she'd noticed and heard. Her father's angry speech sometimes, the tears she'd seen in her mother's eyes, the abrupt changes of subject when she came into the room when her mother was entertaining friends, and the quarrels between her parents that got more and more frequent when they thought she was in bed and asleep. Usually, they didn't insist that she do anything except homework and chores, but this year, they insisted that she go to summer camp. She wondered what she'd find when she returned home. She wondered if both of her parents would still be living in the same house, and if not, which one of them would be gone. The main door of the lodge opened, and a white figure in a raincoat and a hat came in. It was Miss Schaefer. She hung her coat and hat on a peg and stepped into the room, looked around, and saw the girls standing in a circle over by the fireplace. They were staring with great concentration at objects scattered on a blanket, with Kathy Bowers standing behind them, timing them with her watch. "Kim's Game!" Lydia Schaefer had never liked it, thought it was stupid. She didn't have the kind of memory you need to be good at games like that either. She nodded to Kathy Bowers and crossed the room to the far corner, with its comfortable, overstuffed chairs and a sofa and coffee table littered with books and old magazines. She sat down in one of the chairs and picked up a magazine. She took her reading glasses out of a case and put the case back in her shirt pocket. As she did, she noticed a girl on the sofa opposite her, sitting up straight, her pointy nose buried in a book. She looked as though she had been crying, or wanted to cry. Lydia Schaefer smiled and said, "I was always rotten at Kim's Game too when I was your age. Don't let it bother you." Nora glanced up, as if surprised she was no longer alone. Her eyes met Miss Schaefer's without expression. She didn't like Miss Schaefer, because she knew Miss Schaefer didn't like her. And not just her either. Miss Schaefer didn't like children, period. Nora wondered why she was a camp counselor. Then she shrugged and decided it didn't matter. She had enough adults to try and figure out without adding another one to the list. "What's your name?" Miss Schaefer persisted, somewhat uneasy under the child's stare. She also didn't like getting a shrug for a response. Hadn't she tried to console the child for being no good at a game?
Nora.
It wasn't just objects on a blanket Miss Schaefer wasn't able to remember. Next page. "I'd probably be rotten at Kim's game now, too," Miss Schaefer went on. "Oh well, I'm sure you and I have inner lives that are much more interesting than theirs, don't we?"
I guess so,
Nora said, wanting to get back to her book. "It's probably why we wear glasses," Miss Schaefer went on, as if determined to make friends with Nora. "We don't need outer reality as much as other people, so our eyes—" Before she could finish what Nora already knew was going to be a dumb sentence, a voice interrupted. "Could I see you in my office, Lydia?" Miss Schaefer turned quickly and looked over her shoulder, startled at the officious tone of voice. It was Ruth Terrill, the head counselor. "Sure, Ruth," she said, trying to keep her voice normal. "Now?" "Please," Ruth said. Nora watched the two women disappear into the hallway. She'd known they hadn't liked each other for most of the 3 days she'd been at camp, but until that moment, she hadn't known Miss Schaefer was afraid of Miss Terrill. She wondered why, then shrugged again. These adults and the things going on between them weren't her problem. Quickly, she dipped her nose back into her book. Over by the fireplace, the other girls were playing another round of Kim's game.
You'd think they'd have just about every small object in the lodge memorized by now,
Nora thought. She would have. That night, when she first heard the voices, she thought she was at home and in her own bed, because they sounded the way her parents did when they thought she was asleep and wouldn't be able to hear them discussing whatever it was that was wrong between them that they were keeping from her. Then, seeing the long beams in the darkness above her and hearing the rain dripping from the eaves, she remembered where she was. She could hear the quiet sounds the girls around her made in their sleep and the sound of the wind in the forest outside. She hated the wind this summer, a sickly, menacing noise that never seemed to stop. The voices were those of the camp counselors in the main room of the lodge. Just as she did at home when her parents' voice woke her up, she slipped out of bed and went to listen. She tiptoed down the row of sleeping girls, then down the dark hall to the door to the main room. It wasn't closed all the way, which was why she'd been able to hear the voices. Lydia Schaefer was describing how, just a little while ago, she'd been hurrying up to the lodge from her cabin. She'd heard sudden rustling in the forest next to the path, and then a man had grabbed her from behind. He had a knife, she said, and he threatened her with it. But she managed to tear herself away from him and run back to the lodge. She was still out of breath. Nora could hear that. One of the other counselors asked Miss Schaefer why she hadn't shouted for help. She said she was too frightened at first, and then, when she saw the lights of the lodge and knew the man wasn't going to catch up to her, she didn't want to scare the girls by making a lot of noise. The head counselor, Ruth Terrill, asked her if she could describe the man. It was so dark, Miss Schaefer answered, and it happened so fast that she didn't get a good look at him. But she thought he was tall, and he was wearing glasses. She was sure of that. Miss Terrill said that she was going to call the sheriff, and they all agreed not to worry the girls with it.
That's what adults were always trying to do,
Nora thought as she tiptoed back down the hall to bed.
They don't want to worry the girls. My mom and dad are breaking up, but they don't want me to know about it. Adults are a lot more childish than children in a lot of ways,
she thought. She was barely awake, trying to identify every creaking noise the old building made in the night when she heard a car driving up the dirt road to the lodge. A car door shut quietly, and, as she fell asleep, she could hear the voices again in the main room, a man's voice among them now. She dreamed of the forest and of a man waiting for her among the trees. The next morning, Nora looked up from her book and saw through the big front window a police car pull up in front of the lodge and a large man in a brown uniform climb out. Miss Terrill and Miss Schaefer must have been watching for him too, for they met him before he could come inside. They stood on the wide porch, out of the rain, talking in voices too low for Nora to hear. She wondered if it was the same man who'd come when Miss Terrill called the police the night before.
The other girls probably wouldn't have paid any attention to him, even if he'd come in,
Nora thought.
They were all sitting at the dining room table writing letters home, probably complaining about the lack of television and shopping malls and anything fun to do.
Nora wasn't going to give her parents the satisfaction of complaining about anything. Besides, she didn't know which one of them would be there to read whatever she wrote. The weather was clearing up, and they were supposed to go horseback riding the next day. Maybe, on account of the man in the forest, they'd stay indoors. She hoped so. After all the other girls were asleep that night, she lay in bed and thought about the man in the forest with the knife. She had a good imagination and could see the knife blade and the lenses of his glasses glittering in the moonlight as he watched the lodge from the darkness, watched and waited for somebody to come down the path alone. What would Miss Terrill do, she wondered, if he tried to come into the lodge, tried to kidnap one of the girls? Miss Terrill always slept in the lodge with them. The other counselors had small cabins of their own, 2 to a cabin, except for Miss Schaefer, who had a cabin all to herself, farthest down the path. Apparently, none of the other counselors wanted to share a cabin with Miss Schaefer, or else she didn't like any of them. Nora was glad she didn't have to sleep in one of those cabins, alone in the forest with the darkness and the sick wind in the pines that never stopped, and the man in the trees. Then she heard a noise. It sounded like the start of a shout coming from the lodge's main room, and then the sound of something falling. She sat up and strained to hear more, but there wasn't anything more, only the quiet breathing of the sleeping girls in the room with her and the wind. She started at the door to the main room, waited for it to open for a tall man wearing glasses to come through, but nothing happened. Maybe she'd been asleep and dreaming. Maybe it had been her imagination. But she couldn't stand it here any more than at home. She had to know. She slipped out of bed and crept silently down the dark hall on her bare feet. She opened the door a crack very slowly and peered into the room. At first, she thought it was empty except for the moonlight, but then she saw something on the floor by the fireplace, a huddled figure. She forgot the man in the forest with the knife. She forgot to be scared. She went across the room to see who it was. It was Miss Terrill. She was lying on her back, staring up at the ceiling, the wooden handle of a knife protruding from her. Nora stared for a long moment, seeing everything there was to see. Miss Terrill's brown leather bag on the floor by her hand, and the things that had spilled out from it, some of them in the slowly spreading blood, and some where the blood didn't reach. A sound, a flicker of movement, made her look up. Miss Schaefer was coming through the front door. "What are you doing out of bed, child? You get... Ruth!" She rushed over to Miss Terrill and knelt by her, saw what Nora had seen, and scrambled back to her feet. "Did you see what happened?" she asked.
"No, I just heard something, so I..."
"You can't stay here," Miss Schaefer said. "Come with me." She took Nora by the hand and, instead of taking her back to the dormitory, almost dragged her across the room and down the hall to the kitchen. "What's your name again?"
"Nora."
"Oh yes, Nora," Miss Schaefer said. "The little girl who likes to read. You stay here until I come back. You'll be all right. Whoever did that to poor Ruth is gone now." She pushed Nora down onto a chair. "I'm going to call the police. Don't go back to the dorm. You might wake the other girls, and we don't want to scare them, do we? Promise?" Nora promised, and Miss Schaefer turned and went quickly down the hall. Nora didn't like it in the kitchen. The clock on the wall made an ominous humming noise, like the wind outside. It was almost 1 a.m. There were knives on the drying board by the sink that the cook used to cut meat and vegetables, sharp and glittery in the moonlight pouring through the window, with handles like the one on the knife in Miss Terrill. The man from the forest might have been here, might be here now, hiding in the pantry or the closet or in the darkness over by the stove. A sudden noise behind her made her jump and spin around, but nothing moved in the kitchen's shadows. It was probably a mouse. Nora didn't like that thought either, because she wasn't wearing shoes. She didn't care what she'd promised Miss Schaefer, and she ran back to the main room. She meant to cross the door to the fireplace, run to the room where the telephone was and Miss Schaefer, but when she got to Miss Terrill's body, she couldn't help it. She stopped to look again. What she saw this time terrified her. "I told you to stay in the kitchen," Miss Schaefer said, so close that Nora jumped and almost screamed. Her voice was soft and cold with anger, the worst kind, and she took Nora in her hard grip.
"I got scared,"
Nora said, trying not to tremble. They were alone with the body, the two of them, and the hallway door was closed. The other children slept soundly. The other counselors were far away. "Scared? Of what?" Then Nora blurted out so suddenly it surprised her.
"Of him!"
"Who?" In spite of herself, Miss Schaefer straightened up and looked quickly around the room.
"A man,"
Nora said.
"He was looking at me through the kitchen window."
"What did he look like?" Miss Schaefer sounded as surprised as Nora.
"He was big,"
Nora told her.
"tall, and he had dark hair. Miss Schaefer, what if he comes back?"
"I locked the door," Miss Schaefer said. "He can't get in now. Nobody can." And then she asked, "How could you see him through the window, Nora? It's dark outside."
"Because,"
Nora said, and hesitated, trying desperately to think of an explanation, feeling Miss Schaefer's cold eyes on her and remembering the knives in the kitchen that glittered in the moonlight.
"Because the moon was so bright, I could see it glittering in his glasses."
Miss Schaefer thought about that for a moment, and then she exhaled and relaxed her grip on Nora's arm. She almost smiled. "I called the police," she said. "They'll be here soon. I don't think you have anything to be afraid of now." Nora didn't think so either. The police arrived, and the sheriff, the man she'd seen talking to Miss Terrill and Miss Schaefer that morning. The other counselors came too, staring down in horror at Ruth Terrill. One of them took Nora by the arm and led her over to the couch by the front windows, away from the body. She said that wasn't anything for a girl her age to see, but since she'd found the body, she'd have to talk to the policeman. Nora almost laughed at how dumb that sounded. She could see the heads of some of the other girls crowded in the entryway to the dorm, their eyes big. A counselor was standing in front of them to keep them from seeing too much. Miss Schaefer explained to the other counselors that she'd been afraid to go outside and down the path to tell them what had happened, not with the killer on the loose, and of course, she hadn't wanted to leave Nora and the rest of the children alone either. After all, he'd attacked her too, out there in the forest, but she'd been lucky, luckier than Ruth Terrill. She managed to get away from him. The sheriff asked her why she'd come up to the lodge in the first place. She told him she'd left her book there, the one she wanted to read in bed before going to sleep. "I had my flashlight," she said, "and I ran all the way." Then she called over to Nora, as if anxious to turn the attention away from herself. "Tell the sheriff about the man you saw at the window in the kitchen, Nora."
"I didn't see anybody,"
Nora answered.
"but I saw something else over by Miss Terrill's body."
"What did you see?" the sheriff asked. "Come over here and tell me."
"No, you go over by Miss Terrill's body."
Go?
The sheriff hesitated, gave her a puzzled look, and then he did as she asked. Something in her voice made him do that. "What is this all about?" Miss Schaefer wanted to know. "You told me, Nora." Nora didn't pay any attention to her, only looked to make sure one of the policemen was standing between her and Miss Schaefer.
"You just tell me if I'm right about the things scattered around Miss Terrill,"
she called to the sheriff. "Nora," Miss Schaefer said, and tried hard to laugh, "we're not playing Kim's game now."
"What's Kim's game?"
the sheriff asked.
It's a game we play sometimes,
Nora told him.
when we have to be indoors on account of the weather. Miss Bowers gives us about 15 seconds to look at a lot of things she's put on a blanket on the floor, and then we have to go to another part of the room and write down everything we remember. Whoever remembers the most things wins.
Nora's just like me, Sheriff, Miss Schaefer said. She's not very good at it. Her laugh had the same sickly sound as the wind had in the forest, but the forest was quiet now. Nora looked back at the sheriff and said,
There's a pen and a little tube of sun cream and a pocket knife with a red handle. There's a change purse, too. It's brown.
That's right,
the sheriff said, glancing across the room at her. She was staring straight ahead with her eyes wide open. The sheriff had a daughter, too, but when she tried hard to remember things, she screwed her eyes tight shut.
There's some keys on a ring,
Nora went on.
in the middle of the blood, and there's a box of Band-Aids and a comb next to them. There's money, too. 2 quarters and some dimes. 3 dimes, I think.
Is that all?
The sheriff asked.
That's all there is now.
Nora said.
But when I found Miss Terrill, there was a glasses case, and the glasses were still in it. It was blue and red, plaid, and part of it was in the blood. You can still see where it was if you look. I could, anyway, when I came back in here. After Miss Schaefer took me to the kitchen and left me there alone. There's a kind of notch in the blood where the glasses case was. The blood must have run up against it and then had to go around.
The sheriff looked and said,
The notch is still there, Nora, in the blood. Do you know where the case is now?
No.
She said.
Do you know who has a glasses case like that?
Yes.
She said in a very small voice, but forcing herself to look at Miss Schaefer. You have a plaid glasses case, Lydia, Miss Bowers said to Miss Schaefer. Miss Schaefer ran out of the lodge, but didn't get far. Maybe she didn't try very hard, or maybe she didn't want to be alone in the forest. I should have cut your little throat when I had the chance, she said to Nora when one of the policemen brought her back into the lodge. She was smiling when she said it, but it wasn't the nicest smile Nora had ever seen. The glasses had fallen out of Miss Schaefer's jacket pocket as she had killed Miss Terrill. She didn't notice it was gone until she started down the path to her cabin, but when she came back to get it, Nora was there. After she took Nora to the kitchen, she went back and got the case, wiped off the blood, and then put it back in her pocket before she called the sheriff. Why had she killed Miss Terrill? Nora never found out, and she didn't care anyway. It had to do with something that happened between the two women a long time ago, probably before Nora was even born. The kind of thing adults fight over, not really caring who gets hurt. It was the kind of thing kids aren't supposed to know about, so Nora only got bits and pieces of the story. When they heard about the murder, some of the parents drove up the mountain and took their daughters home. For a while, there was a regular parade of cars arriving and departing with little girls. Some of the cars had one parent in them, and some had both. The sun was shining, and Nora was getting ready to go horseback riding with the girls who were left when Miss Bauer came out and told her that her mother was on the phone and wanted to know if she wanted to go home. Her horse had big eyes, like brown marbles, with curiosity in them. Nora wondered what it would be like to ride a horse like that.
Tell Mom I'm fine,
She said to Miss Bowers.
and that I'm having a good time. Tell her to say hello to Dad for me too, and give him a big kiss if she can.
The man in charge of the horses showed the girls how to mount them, and when they were all ready, they rode into the forest together.